3 days before a wedding, most brides are arguing with florists or tracking down late RSVPs. I was standing in my narrow kitchen, a lukewarm cup of coffee in my hand, listening to my father cancel his part in my life. The call came through right at noon. My father, Richard, rarely called me during market hours unless there was a problem to manage. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply delivered the verdict in the same brisk, detached tone he used to terminate building contractors. "I'm not walking you down the aisle, Hazel," he said. I set my coffee mug on the counter. The ceramic made a dull thud against the laminate. I watched a drop of brown liquid spill over the rim. "Vanessa is in a fragile state," he continued, his voice carrying the slight echo of his spacious downtown office. "She called off her engagement last month. Seeing me walk you down the aisle right now in front of all those people, it would just upset her. It's bad optics. We can't rub this in her face." I let the math of his statement settle in the quiet apartment. My older sister Vanessa had returned a 2-carat diamond to a hedge fund manager because his career trajectory didn't meet her timeline for a corner office. Her ego was bruised, therefore my wedding the day I married the man I loved was an affront to her sensibilities. "So you aren't walking me?" I said, my voice held steady. "I'll be there," he amended quickly, preserving his own technical innocence. "I'll sit in the back, but standing up there handing you off, it sends the wrong message. You're a practical girl. You get it." There was a rustle of movement on the line, followed by the crisp voice of my mother, Patricia. She was on speakerphone, acting as the eternal buffer for my father's decisions. "Just walk alone, Hazel," she said, her tone light and breezy, as if suggesting I change my shoe color. "Be flexible. It isn't a big deal in the grand scheme of things. We just need to keep the peace this weekend." Flexible. In our family, that word was a command. It meant I was expected to fold myself into a neat, invisible box so Vanessa could take up the rest of the room. I looked out my small window. The L train rattled past on the elevated tracks, a steady blue-collar rhythm beneath the towering steel and glass of the Chicago skyline. My father built those glass towers. He belonged to them. He measured a person's worth by square footage and zip codes. I belonged to the rhythm of the train. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I had spent my entire childhood twisting myself into knots, hoping they would finally look at me with pride. But in that silent kitchen, the waiting just stopped. Something deep and fundamental shifted inside my chest, locking into a cold, clear resolve. "Okay, Dad," I said. "Okay, good. I'm glad you understand." The relief in his exhale was audible. I was a handled problem, a closed file. "We'll see you Friday." I tapped the screen and ended the call. But what my father didn't know, what he could never have calculated in all his corporate risk assessments, was that 72 hours later he would be sitting in the back row of a historic botanical conservatory, checking his expensive watch, waiting to watch me walk out alone. He didn't know that when the heavy oak doors finally swung open, the elite guests he worshipped would go dead silent, because on that day I didn't walk alone. And when my father saw the man holding my arm, his face would turn the color of ash. Before we go any further, if you know what it feels like to be the daughter who is always pushed to the side, welcome to Revenge Order. If this story speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe and drop a comment below. What is your age, and have you ever had to draw a hard line with your own family? Now let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon, the exact moment I stopped shrinking. The silence in my apartment felt different after the phone clicked off. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of rejection. It was the sharp, clean silence of a closed door. I leaned against the counter and took a slow breath. For 24 years I had played my assigned role. I was the safe, boring daughter, the one who lived in a walk-up apartment instead of a high-rise, the one who chose a modest life over a ruthless pursuit of status. Richard and Patricia had spent their lives cultivating a very specific image in the cutthroat circles of Chicago's upper crust. They attended the right galas, shook hands with the right politicians, and invested everything in Vanessa. Vanessa was the golden investment. She wore tailored suits, worked as a junior partner at a prestigious law firm, and operated with a cold efficiency that my father adored. She was a shark in a tailored skirt. I was a disappointment. When relatives asked what I did for a living, my mother would wave her hand and say, "I did some freelance typing." It was a polite way of saying I had no title, no ambition, and no real future. They looked at my quiet life and saw failure. My phone vibrated on the counter, jarring me back to the present. The screen lit up with a text message from Vanessa. It was a long block of text, devoid of any congratulations or warmth. It was a list. She had outlined 3 specific rules for the wedding weekend to protect her emotional state. The final rule was a directive instructing me not to wear a veil, claiming it was too traditional and would make the ceremony feel too heavy. She wanted me unadorned. She wanted me plain. She wanted me to look exactly how they all saw me. I read the text twice. I didn't type a response. Instead, I set the phone face down, picked up my keys, and walked out the door. The crisp Illinois air hit my face as I headed toward my neighborhood coffee shop. I had a job to do. My family thought I was just a typist, a girl scrambling for pennies in the gig economy. They thought they held all the cards. They had no idea who I actually worked for, or the kind of power I held in my fingertips every single day. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, cutting through the crisp autumn wind as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and damp wool. It was a modest, independent cafe in my neighborhood, a place where the tables were slightly scarred and the Wi-Fi was reliable. I took my usual seat in the back corner, pulling my laptop from my tote bag. This was my sanctuary. To my family, this was the sad little room where I played at having a career. Whenever my father hosted his high-stakes dinners at the country club, the inevitable question of what his children did for a living would arise. Richard would puff his chest and declare that Vanessa was on the fast track to partner at a premier corporate law firm. Then the guest would turn to me. My father would offer a tight, patronizing smile and say I was doing some administrative gig work. Vanessa would usually chime in, swirling her wine, adding that I was a freelance typist picking up odd jobs while I figured out my life. I never corrected them. I let them paint me as the unambitious sister scraping by on minimum wage. Explaining the reality of my daily life would have required them to listen, and my family only listened to people they deemed useful. If Richard Montgomery knew the truth about my client list, he would not have respected me. He would have weaponized me. I opened my laptop and the screen flickered to life. I was not a typist. For the past 4 years, I had operated as a high-level ghostwriter and crisis communications strategist for some of the most influential figures in the state. When a tech founder needed to apologize for a data breach without admitting legal liability, I wrote the script. When a political donor needed an op-ed placed in a major publication to gently shift public policy, I drafted the narrative. I crafted the words that shaped public perception, operating entirely in the shadows. But my most demanding client, the man who commanded the vast majority of my time and paid a monthly retainer that eclipsed my father's annual country club dues, was Marcus Caldwell. Marcus Caldwell was a legend in Chicago real estate. He was a notoriously reclusive billionaire who had built an empire by anticipating market shifts long before his competitors even recognized the trends. He rarely gave interviews. He despised galas. He communicated through calculated, devastatingly effective public addresses once or twice a year. And for the last 24 months, every public word Marcus Caldwell spoke had been written by me. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. My father had spent the better part of a decade trying to secure a single meeting with Caldwell Holdings. Richard desperately wanted a joint venture on a new waterfront development. He had sent vintage bottles of scotch to Marcus's office, only to receive a polite, generic thank you note from an assistant stating the alcohol had been donated to a charity auction. My father bought VIP tables at charity events he despised, hoping Marcus would attend, only to find an empty chair. Richard viewed Marcus Caldwell as the ultimate validator of his own success. Meanwhile, Marcus Caldwell texted me mundane questions about syntax at 2 a.m. He trusted me to distill his complex visionary strategies into speeches that moved markets. He recognized a grounded Midwestern pragmatism in my writing, a quality that resonated with a public growing tired of flashy corporate jargon. That was the quiet truth of Illinois culture. The loudest people in the room, the ones wearing the most expensive watches and shouting over expensive dinners, rarely held the actual levers of control. True power moved quietly. My phone buzzed against the wooden table. The screen illuminated, displaying another notification from my sister. Vanessa was not satisfied with sending just one list of rules. She was now sending addendums. I unlocked the screen and read the new message. She had elaborated on her previous demand. Just making sure you saw my note about the veil, Hazel. A veil is too theatrical right now. It draws too much attention and makes the whole ceremony feel heavy. A simple pearl headband is more your speed anyway. Let's keep things low-key. Spencer and I were going to have a massive veil, so it just brings up bad memories. Thanks. I stared at the glowing words. She was dictating my bridal attire to manage her own insecurity. She wanted my wedding to look like a budget-friendly afterthought, a muted affair that could never compete with the lavish high society event she had canceled. My father's refusal to walk me down the aisle was just the opening move. They were systematically stripping the joy from my day to ensure their own narrative remained intact. I did not reply. The urge to fight back, to demand respect, had burned out long ago. Arguing with Vanessa was like screaming into a storm. It only left you exhausted and unheard. I silenced the phone and turned it face down on the table, shutting out her demands. I had more important things to do than argue about tulle and lace. I opened a heavily encrypted document on my laptop. It was the final draft of Marcus Caldwell's upcoming keynote address for the Global Real Estate Summit in London next month. This speech was designed to announce a major pivot in his investment strategy, signaling a shift away from luxury commercial towers and towards sustainable, community-driven urban development. The words needed to be precise, authoritative, and inspiring. I lost myself in the rhythm of the work. I adjusted the cadence of a paragraph, ensuring the tone struck the right balance between fiscal responsibility and social awareness. I knew how Marcus spoke. I knew where he liked to pause for emphasis, the subtle self-deprecation he used to disarm a hostile room, and the sharp, unyielding logic he deployed to dismantle critics. Writing for him was a masterclass in psychology. It required deep empathy, a trait my family deemed a weakness, but one that made me indispensable to a billionaire. An hour passed, the coffee shop filled with the lunchtime rush, a symphony of espresso machines and overlapping conversations. I typed the final sentence, reviewed the closing argument, and hit save. The keynote was ready. I drafted a brief email to Marcus, attached the secure file, and sent it off. A sense of profound satisfaction washed over me. I was building a tangible legacy, shaping the dialogue of an entire industry, all from a scratch table in Logan Square. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. My thoughts drifted away from corporate strategy and back to the wedding. Friday was approaching fast, and the logistical realities were settling in. My family believed they held the ultimate leverage over this weekend. They assumed that because I lived in a modest apartment and held a fictitious typing job, I was financially dependent on the goodwill of others. They thought my fiancé Lucas, a dedicated pediatric nurse who worked grueling shifts at a children's hospital, was equally destitute. Richard had been particularly smug about the finances. 6 months ago, during a tense dinner at a downtown steakhouse, he had made a grand show of offering to pay for the venue. He wanted a specific country club, a place where he could invite his investors and use my reception as a networking mixer. When Lucas and I politely declined the country club in favor of something more intimate, Richard had punished us. He withdrew his financial support entirely, citing sudden liquidity issues with a new build. He expected me to panic. He expected me to beg for his help, to concede to his demands just to afford a decent room. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored folder containing my wedding contracts. I flipped open the cover and looked at the primary invoice. It was for a historic botanical conservatory overlooking Lake Michigan, a breathtaking glass structure filled with rare orchids and ancient ferns. It was one of the most exclusive, fiercely guarded venues in the city, a place with a 2-year waiting list and a price tag that would make a sane person flinch. The invoice was stamped with a bold red word, paid. I traced the letters with my index finger. Richard and Patricia had spent the last 6 months loudly whispering to their friends about how Lucas's working-class parents must have taken out a second mortgage to afford such a location. They pitied my future in-laws, framing them as irresponsible dreamers, going into debt for a single night. I let them talk. I let them build their arrogant assumptions. The truth was resting safely in my bank account, a testament to the quiet power I had accumulated while they were busy looking the other way. The tension was building, a slow, inevitable march toward Friday afternoon, and they were walking right into a trap of their own making. 6 months prior, The systematic dismantling of our wedding budget began over medium-rare ribeyes at a dimly lit, mahogany-paneled restaurant downtown. My father had summoned Lucas and me under the guise of celebration, reserving a corner booth where the scent of expensive cigars mixed with the low hum of corporate deals being brokered. Lucas sat beside me, his large hands resting on the crisp white tablecloth. At 26, he carried the quiet, steady demeanor of a man who dealt with real crises for a living. As a pediatric nurse, he spent his shifts navigating the sterile halls of a children's hospital, administering medications and offering solace to terrified parents. He came from a loud, sprawling Irish Catholic family on the South Side. His father was a retired mechanic. His mother taught 4th grade. They measured wealth in Sunday dinners and shared laughter. Richard measured wealth in equity and leverage. To my father, a career in nursing was a stepping stone, a job someone took until they figured out how to monetize a real asset. When Lucas made it clear he loved his clinical work and had no intention of pivoting to medical sales or hospital administration, Richard's smile had frozen into a mask of polite disdain. My father swirled the ice in his crystal glass of bourbon. He cleared his throat, adopting the somber tone of a CEO delivering a quarterly loss to his shareholders. He claimed his capital was currently tied up in a complex zoning dispute for a new commercial park. He cited unexpected overhead and tight liquidity. He wrapped his betrayal in corporate jargon, explaining that he could no longer honor his promise to fund our reception. He offered a tight, patronizing apology, suggesting we scale back our expectations and find a modest banquet hall in the suburbs. He waited for me to break. He waited for me to realize that choosing Lucas meant forfeiting my access to the Montgomery lifestyle. Lucas did not argue. He did not defend his own honor. He simply reached under the heavy linen tablecloth, took my hand and squeezed my fingers. His touch was an anchor in the shifting currents. The lie about tight liquidity lasted exactly 4 days. I was sitting on my couch when Vanessa's latest social media post populated my feed. The photo featured a gleaming silver Porsche Macan parked in the circular driveway of my parents' sprawling suburban estate. A large red bow was tied across the hood. The caption was a masterclass in arrogance. When you make junior partner, your dad makes sure you commute in style. Hard work pays off. My father possessed the liquid capital to purchase a luxury sports car on a Tuesday afternoon, but he claimed poverty when it came to hosting the daughter who was marrying a man in scrubs. It was a calculated financial weapon designed to put me in my place. I did not call to scream at him. I did not demand fairness. Fairness was a foreign concept in our bloodline. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into a secure banking portal. I stared at the balance in my independent business account. Every month, Marcus Caldwell authorized a direct transfer to secure my exclusive ghostwriting and strategic services. Over 2 years, that monthly retainer had accumulated into a silent, impenetrable fortress. I drafted an email to the events coordinator at the historic Botanical Conservatory overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a crown jewel of the city, a soaring cathedral of glass and steel filled with ancient ferns, blooming orchids, and creeping ivy. It boasted a 2-year waiting list and a rental fee that would make a sane person flinch. I wired the payment in full that same afternoon. When the formal invitations arrived at my parents' estate, featuring the embossed address of the conservatory, the assumptions began immediately. Patricia called me, her voice coated in a thick layer of condescending pity. She murmured about how reckless it was for the O'Connors to finance such a lavish location. "I just worry about Lucas's parents, Hazel," she sighed into the receiver. "Taking out a second mortgage on their little brick house at their age. It is tragic, really, what people will do to keep up appearances. You should have stopped them." I let her spin the false narrative. I absorbed the pity and the veiled insults. Let them believe my future in-laws were drowning in debt. The truth was my armor, and I wore it beneath my skin where they could never reach it. I packed my laptop into my canvas tote bag and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the coffee shop, leaving the warmth behind. The sky above the Chicago grid was turning a bruised deep violet, signaling the arrival of Wednesday evening. We were 48 hours away from the ceremony. The wind off the lake was sharp and cold. My phone began to ring as I walked down the pavement toward the train station. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I answered, bracing myself for a logistical question about the rehearsal dinner seating chart. Instead, I heard the familiar, sharp intake of breath that preceded a manufactured crisis. Patricia did not ask how I was feeling or if I needed help running errands. She launched directly into a grievance regarding the guest accommodations. I had reserved a block of rooms at a historic, reputable hotel in the Loop. It was elegant, comfortable, and centrally located for our out-of-town friends. It possessed character and warmth. To my mother, it was an insult. "Hazel, your father is very concerned about the room block," she said, her words clipped and accelerating. "He has several associates flying in from the coast, important people, men he has been courting for the harbor redevelopment project. We cannot have them staying at a mid-tier tourist trap. It reflects poorly on our brand." Our brand. My wedding was not a milestone. It was a marketing opportunity, an extension of the Montgomery corporate identity. "The rooms are beautiful and the architecture is classic," I replied, keeping my pace steady along the concrete sidewalk. "Lucas's family is thrilled with the accommodations." "Lucas's family has different standards," Patricia countered smoothly. The elitism was casual woven into her vocabulary like a silk thread. "Richard needs these guests at the Peninsula or the Waldorf. People of this caliber expect luxury. We need you to cancel the current block and upgrade immediately." I stopped walking. The wind whipped past me, biting through my thin wool coat. 2 days before I walked down the aisle, they were still treating me like a junior assistant tasked with managing their itinerary. "I am not moving the hotel block, Mom," I said. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Defiance was rare in our dynamic. I usually nodded and absorbed their demands to keep the peace. "Hazel, you are not thinking about the bigger picture," she insisted, her tone hardening. "Your father is under a tremendous amount of pressure. If Marcus Caldwell's people happen to hear about this event and they see where we are hosting our network, it makes us look amateurish. You need to fix this." The irony hung in the cold air, rich and bitter. She was invoking the name of my boss to bully me into submission. She was terrified of looking small in front of the very man who texted me his private fears about the global market. "The contracts are signed," I told her, dropping my voice an octave. "The deposits are non-refundable. If Dad's associates require high-end amenities, they have assistants who can book their travel. You are welcome to find other accommodations for yourselves if the current hotel does not meet your approval." "You are being incredibly stubborn," she snapped. "We are trying to help you elevate this weekend so you do not embarrass yourself." "You are trying to hijack it," I corrected her. "I have to go. I will see you tomorrow night at the rehearsal dinner." I ended the call before she could issue another command. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady drumbeat of adrenaline. Setting a firm boundary with Patricia was like touching a live wire. The retaliation was always swift and calculated. They were underestimating me at every turn, assuming my quiet nature was a permanent sign of compliance. They thought I was a pawn on their chessboard. They did not realize I owned the board. The tension coiled tighter with every passing hour. Tomorrow night we would all sit across from one another at a small Italian restaurant. My family would bring their arrogance, their status, and their disdain for the man I loved. But I was bringing a quiet, unshakable certainty. The game was shifting, and they were blind to the changing tides. Thursday night arrived carrying the crisp chill of a Midwest autumn. The rehearsal dinner took place at a small, family-owned Italian restaurant, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Dim amber lights cast a warm glow over wooden tables, draped in checkered linen. The air smelled of roasted garlic-rich tomato sauce and baking bread. It was a space designed for laughter and shared meals, chosen specifically by Lucas and his parents, Tom and Martha. Tom, with his calloused hands from 40 years in an auto shop, stood by the bar buying drinks for my bridesmaids. Martha, who spent her days teaching fractions to 9-year-olds, moved from table to table, making sure everyone felt welcome. They radiated a grounded, unpretentious hospitality. By 7:15, the private back room was buzzing with the easy chatter of the O'Connor family. Everyone had settled into their seats, wine glasses full, stories flowing freely. Everyone except my family. At 7:45, the heavy wooden door at the front of the restaurant swung open. A gust of cold wind rushed into the room, followed immediately by Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa. They did not enter quietly. They arrived like a storm front, bringing the cutthroat energy of the Chicago Loop right into the cozy dining room. Richard was speaking loudly into his phone, his voice carrying over the gentle background music. He was barking orders about a zoning permit, ensuring every person in the room knew his time was valuable. Patricia walked a half-step behind him, her designer coat draped immaculately over her shoulders, her eyes scanning the rustic decor with thinly veiled disdain. Vanessa trailed them, scrolling on her screen, looking profoundly bored. Martha hurried over to greet them, wiping her hands on an apron she had donned to help the kitchen carry out the first course of appetizers. She offered a warm, genuine smile. "Richard, Patricia, we are so glad you made it," Martha said, extending her hand. Martha ended his call, sliding the phone into his tailored suit jacket. He looked at Martha's outstretched hand for a fraction of a second too long before accepting the greeting. "Traffic on the Kennedy Expressway," Richard lied smoothly, plus a crucial business meeting ran late. "A multi-million-dollar acquisition does not pause for a pasta dinner. I am sure you understand the pressure." He handed his expensive wool overcoat to Tom, holding it out as if my future father-in-law was the restaurant coat check attendant. Tom blinked his warm smile, faltering slightly, but his Midwestern manners won out. He took the coat, folded it carefully, and set it on a nearby chair. The Montgomerys took their seats at the head table. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The easy-flowing conversation flatlined into a strained, polite murmur. My parents treated the waitstaff like an inconvenience, waving them away without making eye contact and demanding a different vintage of wine than the one already pouring. Patricia picked at her baked ziti, pushing the pasta around her plate as if inspecting it for flaws. When Martha tried to engage her in a conversation about the floral arrangements for tomorrow, Patricia offered one-word answers, steering the topic back to the inconvenience of the hotel location and the caliber of the guests she had invited. I sat next to Lucas watching the performance. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the old childhood reflex to apologize for them, to smooth over their sharp edges. I took a slow breath, forcing the tension out of my shoulders. Lucas reached under the checkered tablecloth. His large, warm hand found mine. His thumb traced a steady, reassuring circle against my knuckles. He did not say a word. He did not need to. His touch spoke volumes. It was a silent promise that we were a team, that their arrogance could not touch the life we were building together. I squeezed his fingers in return, anchoring myself to his quiet strength. The real execution began just as the dessert plates were being cleared. Vanessa pushed her chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She picked up her wineglass and a silver spoon, tapping the rim until the delicate crystal rang out, demanding the attention of the entire room. The chatter died down, faces turned toward her. She stood smoothing her tailored skirt, projecting the polished confidence of a trial lawyer addressing a jury. She smiled, but the warmth did not reach her eyes. "I want to say a few words," Vanessa announced, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet space, "about my little sister." She paused, letting the silence stretch, holding the room hostage. "When Hazel told us she was getting married at 24, I think we were all a bit shocked. It takes a lot of bravery to settle down so young, especially when you are still trying to figure out your own path." She cast a brief, pitying glance at my plain dress. Most girls our age are focused on building their portfolios, making partner, or securing their financial independence. But Hazel has always marched to the beat of her own drum. She has always been content with a simple life, a modest apartment, a quiet little routine. Martha shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Tom looked down at his coffee cup, his jaw tightening. They recognized the venom hidden beneath the honeyed tone. "Lucas," Vanessa continued, turning her gaze to my fiancé, "you are a very lucky man. Hazel does not require much. She is easy to please, and I know you both believe that love conquers all." She raised her glass higher, her smile sharpening into a blade. "But as those of us in the real world know, love is sweet, but success is what keeps the lights on. Let us raise a glass to Hazel and Lucas. May they find exactly what they are looking for, even if it is just a little bit of happiness." The room remained frozen. The insult was clear, devastating, and delivered with perfect, plausible deniability. If I objected, I would look like a hysterical, insecure bride ruining a toast. If Lucas yelled, he would validate their assumption that his family lacked class. My father beamed. He proudly raised his crystal glass and clinked it against Vanessa's, rewarding her cruelty. Patricia nodded along, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, looking entirely satisfied with the public humiliation. I did not break. I did not cry. I looked directly at my sister and I smiled. It was a practiced, serene smile, the kind of smile you give someone when you know a secret that is going to dismantle their entire reality. I felt the steady warmth of Lucas's hand enveloping mine. I knew the game was almost over. They were spending their final chips on a hand they had already lost. A polite, sparse smattering of applause followed the toast. The energy in the room was suffocated heavy with second-hand embarrassment. The O'Connor relatives exchanged awkward glances, trying to quickly pivot the conversation to safer topics like the weather and the upcoming football season. I let the noise build back up for a few minutes before I leaned toward Lucas. "I am going to step out for some air," I whispered. He nodded, his eyes searching my face for any sign of fracture. Finding none, he kissed my temple. "Take your time. I will hold the fort." I pushed my chair back and slipped away from the table, navigating through the narrow spaces between the chairs until I reached the front door. I pushed it open and stepped out into the crisp Chicago night. The cold air filled my lungs sharp and clean. The streetlights cast a yellow glow across the damp pavement, illuminating the quiet neighborhood block. Inside that restaurant, my family was busy writing a narrative where I was the pathetic, penniless sister relying on charity. They were so consumed by their own fictional hierarchy that they never bothered to look beyond their own reflection. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my shoulders, letting the rhythm of the distant city traffic steady my racing pulse. I tilted my head back, looking up at the starless, cloudy sky. We were mere hours away from the ceremony. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I assumed it was a frantic text from the florist or a logistical update from the venue coordinator. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the device. The caller ID illuminated the dark sidewalk. It was not the florist. The screen displayed the name Marcus Caldwell. My billionaire client did not call outside of scheduled business hours unless there was a critical pivot in strategy. Tomorrow was my wedding day, a fact his executive assistant had blocked out on his calendar for months. Receiving a direct phone call from him at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night meant something required immediate attention. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. "Hazel," Marcus said, his deep, resonant voice coming through the speaker. "I am reviewing the final draft of the London keynote you sent over this afternoon." I stood on the quiet street corner, and the faint sound of my father's booming laughter leaking through the restaurant window behind me, and I prepared to talk to the man who held the keys to the kingdom my family worshipped. "I am reviewing the third page of the London address," Marcus said. His voice was a low rumble against the ambient noise of the Chicago street traffic. He did not ask if it was a good time to call. We operated on a baseline of mutual availability. The transition paragraph regarding the shift from luxury development to community infrastructure. "You softened the language. I need to know why you pulled the punch." I leaned against the brick exterior of the restaurant, shielding my phone from the biting wind. I closed my eyes and summoned the architecture of the speech. "Because the European investors require a bridge, Marcus. If you pivot too sharply, they will view the community initiative as a charity project rather than a viable fiscal strategy. We have to guide them to the conclusion. We cannot force them into it." My logic was sound. I knew it, he knew it, but as I delivered the explanation, my voice betrayed me. A slight tremor slipped through the syllables. The suffocating weight of Vanessa and her toxic toast had cracked my professional veneer. I took a shallow breath, hoping the cellular connection would mask the fatigue. It did not. Marcus Caldwell possessed an uncanny ability to read the unspoken currents in any room, and he extended that skill to phone conversations. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of pages turning on his end of the line. "Your rationale is flawless," Marcus finally replied. "The text stays as you drafted it. Now tell me why you sound like you are standing on the edge of a cliff." I tried to deflect the observation. I told him it was just the autumn wind coming off Lake Michigan. I insisted I was merely tired from finalizing the seating charts and confirming vendor schedules. "Hazel," he said softly, shutting down the excuses, "I have trusted you to navigate the most complex corporate crises of my career. I trust you to tell me when the narrative is spinning out of control. Your voice is hollow. What is happening?" The genuine concern in his tone dismantled my defenses. I had spent my entire life shielding my family from the consequences of their own arrogance, absorbing their insults to maintain a fragile peace. Standing alone on the cold pavement, the urge to simply state the truth out loud overpowered my instinct to hide. "My father informed me that he will not be walking me down the aisle tomorrow," I said. The words tasted bitter in the cold air, but speaking them to an outsider stripped away their power. The silence on the other end of the line deepened. Marcus did not offer a meaningless platitude. He waited for the context. "My sister recently canceled her engagement to a wealthy man," I continued, staring at a flickering street lamp. "My father believes that participating in my ceremony would be insensitive to her current emotional state. He told me that standing at the altar with me is bad optics. He will be attending the wedding, but he plans to sit in the back row. He expects me to walk alone." "Richard Montgomery," Marcus said. He spoke the name with the clinical detachment of a scientist, identifying a common, uninteresting specimen. "The man who sends my office a bottle of vintage scotch every quarter. The man who spends his evenings trying to secure an audience with my acquisitions team." "Yes," I confirmed quietly, "that is my father." "He is a man driven entirely by the perception of influence rather than the possession of it," Marcus observed. "I have reviewed his portfolio. He builds flashy properties with cheap materials. He is desperate for proximity to real capital. And he is willing to publicly humiliate his own daughter to protect the ego of a sister who failed to secure a hedge fund manager." The accuracy of his assessment was breathtaking. Marcus had diagnosed my family dynamic in less than a minute. "I am sorry for bringing personal matters into our workflow," I said, feeling a sudden wave of embarrassment. I did not answer the phone looking for a solution. I just needed to say it out loud. "Tomorrow is going to be a difficult performance." "You do not need to apologize to me," Marcus replied. His voice shifted, losing the casual conversational tone and adopting the authoritative timbre he used when finalizing a major acquisition. "I know the exact measure of your character, Hazel. I know the brilliance of your mind. I watch you shape the global dialogue of my company every single day. You are the architect of my public trust." I gripped the phone tighter, my throat tightening with unshed emotion. My own father had just spent an hour laughing at my expense, yet a billionaire was taking time out of his evening to remind me of my worth. "Go back inside," Marcus instructed gently. "Hold your head high, get some rest tonight, and understand this: a woman who writes the words that move markets should never walk alone." Before I could formulate a response, the line clicked and went silent. I lowered the phone, staring at the darkened screen. The cryptic nature of his final sentence lingered in the night air. I did not know what he intended to do. I did not know if it was merely a comforting sentiment or a promise. But as I tucked the device back into my coat pocket, the crushing weight of my father and his ultimatum had vanished. I turned around and reached for the heavy brass handle of the restaurant door. I pulled it open and stepped back into the warmth of the private dining room. The atmosphere had not improved during my absence. The tension remained thick, hovering over the tables like a dense fog. I paused near the entryway, allowing my eyes to adjust to the amber lighting. I took a moment to truly observe the people occupying the space. Across the room, Tom O'Connor was standing near the head table. He held a coffee pot in his weathered hand, offering a refill to my father. Tom was smiling, attempting to bridge the icy gap my family had created. He was extending the same humble, generous hospitality he offered to everyone he met. Richard Montgomery did not even look up. He sat slouched in his chair, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his smartphone. He was scrolling through a stock portfolio, watching the after-hours trading numbers fluctuate. He waved a dismissive hand in Tom's direction, a silent command for the older man to go away. It was a gesture typically reserved for a nuisance. Beside Richard, Patricia was applying a fresh coat of lipstick, using the reflection of her butter knife as a mirror. She looked bored, eager to escape the rustic surroundings and return to her curated environment. Vanessa sat across from them, swirling the last drops of wine in her glass, her posture radiating a smug satisfaction from her successful toast. For 24 years, looking at that specific tableau would have filled me with a desperate, frantic need to fix it. I would have rushed over, apologized for my father, offered to pour the coffee myself, and tried to spark a safe, superficial conversation to manufacture a sense of unity. I would have bent myself backward to earn a crumb of their approval. Tonight, looking at Richard, ignoring a kind man, to stare at a digital graph, I felt nothing. The final frayed string of my childhood desperation snapped. It did not break with a loud, dramatic rupture. It severed quietly, dissolving into dust. The illusion of their superiority was gone. I saw them for exactly what they were. They were frightened people who used arrogance as a shield to hide their own lack of substance. They were trapped in a shallow game of status, blind to anything that did not carry a price tag. I walked back to my seat. Lucas looked up, his eyes scanning my face for any lingering distress. He saw the shift immediately. The tension in my jaw had relaxed. My posture was straight. I smiled at him, and it was a real, genuine smile. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you are standing on solid ground. "Are you all right?" Lucas asked quietly, pulling my chair out for me. "I am better than all right," I replied, taking my seat and reaching for his hand. "I am ready." Tomorrow the sun would rise over Lake Michigan. Tomorrow I would put on a white dress and a pearl headband. I would travel to a glass conservatory, and I would watch my father take a seat in the back row. He would attempt to render me invisible. But as I sat in the warm restaurant holding the hand of the man I loved, I knew my father was walking blindly into his own ruin. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and I was finally ready to let the game play out. Friday morning arrived with a brilliant, unclouded sky. Sunlight poured through the soaring glass panels of the historic conservatory, casting long geometric shadows across the limestone floors. The bridal suite was tucked away in the west wing of the building, a quiet sanctuary surrounded by creeping ivy and blooming orchids. The air inside the room smelled of damp earth, sweet floral nectar, and hairspray. For the first time in months, I felt genuine peace. I sat in a plush velvet chair in the center of the room while my two closest friends moved around me. Sarah and Emily had been my roommates in college. They were the kind of women who showed up with coffee and an empathetic ear when life became difficult. Sarah taught middle school English in the suburbs, and Emily managed a small, thriving bakery on the north side. They did not care about designer labels or social climbing. They cared about loyalty. They formed a protective barrier around me, ensuring the morning remained insulated from the toxic energy of my family. Sarah carefully pinned my hair into a low twist. Emily steamed the wrinkles from my wedding gown, humming a soft, unfamiliar tune. We drank sparkling water and talked about Lucas. We talked about his kindness and the life we were preparing to build. The anxiety that usually accompanied any Montgomery family event was entirely absent. At 3 o'clock, I stepped into my dress. It was a classic silhouette, devoid of excessive embellishments or heavy beadwork. It suited me perfectly. Then Sarah opened a wide, flat box resting on the vanity. She lifted the veil. It was a sheer, cathedral-length cascade of tulle edged with delicate lace. Vanessa had sent a clear directive demanding I skip this exact accessory. She claimed a veil was too theatrical and would make the ceremony feel heavy. Her underlying motivation was obvious. She wanted me to look plain. She wanted to ensure my wedding did not resemble the grand event she had recently canceled. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, holding the comb in her hands. She knew the tension surrounding my family. "I have never been more sure of anything," I replied, meeting her gaze in the mirror. Sarah smiled, a bright, triumphant expression. She slid the comb into my hair, securing the veil. The sheer fabric fell gracefully over my shoulders, pooling on the floor behind me. I looked at my reflection. I did not look like a freelance typist. I did not look like a disappointment. I looked like a bride. The piece lasted for another 15 minutes. At 3:15, the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite swung open. It did not open with a polite knock or a gentle push. It was thrown wide open, hitting the doorstop with a sharp, echoing thud. Patricia rushed into the room. My mother brought the chaotic, cutthroat energy of the Chicago Loop directly into my quiet sanctuary. Her face was flushed and her breathing was shallow. She clutched her expensive designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. Vanessa strolled into the room a few seconds later. She held a crystal flute of orange juice and champagne. She wore a sleek, slate gray dress that looked more appropriate for a corporate cocktail party than a daytime wedding. She leaned against the doorframe, taking a slow sip of her drink, looking profoundly unbothered by her mother's frantic state. Hazel, thank goodness you are dressed, Patricia gasped, marching toward my chair. She did not compliment my gown. She did not notice my hair. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on Sarah and Emily with a brief flash of annoyance before snapping back to me. "We have a major situation downstairs," Patricia announced. My heart maintained a steady, measured beat. A major situation in the Montgomery household usually translated to a minor inconvenience that threatened their public image. I turned away from the mirror and faced her. "The guests are starting to arrive, Mom," I said smoothly. "The string quartet is tuning their instruments. What is the situation?" Patricia took a deep breath, attempting to project an air of maternal authority. "Your father is in the lobby," she explained, her voice tight and urgent. "He just received a phone call. It is Caldwell Holdings. A senior vice president finally returned his inquiry about the harbor redevelopment project. Richard has been trying to secure a meeting with this firm for 10 years. I kept my expression entirely neutral. The irony was a physical weight in the room. My father was pacing a lobby floor frantically trying to impress a mid-level executive who reported directly to the man whose keynote address I had finalized the night before. "That is great news for his business," I replied calmly, "but the ceremony begins in 45 minutes. He needs to take his seat soon." Patricia let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. She treated my response as a symptom of supreme ignorance. "You are not listening to me," Patricia snapped. "This is a make-or-break negotiation. Richard is trying to lock down a formal lunch meeting for next week. The Caldwell executive is asking detailed questions about the zoning permits. Richard cannot just hang up the phone. He cannot be interrupted for a wedding march. We need to delay the ceremony." Sarah and Emily exchanged a stunned look behind my mother's back. Even for my family, this was a breathtaking level of audacity. "Delay the ceremony," I repeated, ensuring I heard the demand correctly. "Just by an hour," Patricia insisted, waving her hand as if pushing the start time of a wedding was a trivial administrative task. "Tell the coordinator to serve some extra champagne to the guests. Have the musicians play a few more songs. It is not a big deal. Richard needs this hour to secure his contract. He is paying for his own suit, his own travel, his own time. You understand?" She deployed the word like a weapon. "You understand." She expected my ingrained compliance to activate. She expected me to prioritize my father's corporate ambitions over my own wedding vows. Vanessa pushed off the doorframe and took another sip of her mimosa. "Honestly, Hazel, your schedule is arbitrary anyway," Vanessa chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is not exactly the social event of the season. A 1-hour delay is not going to ruin anything. The caterers can keep the food warm. Just be a team player for once. Dad is under a lot of stress." They stood before me, a united front of selfishness. They were asking me to halt my life, to leave my groom waiting at the altar, and to force 150 guests to sit in silent confusion, all so my father could beg for scraps of attention from my own client. I looked past them, catching my reflection in the tall vanity mirror. The veil cascaded down my back, a defiant symbol of my impending independence. I looked at the calm, resolute woman in the glass. The frightened, eager-to-please girl I used to be was gone. She had evaporated in the cold air outside a restaurant the night before. A profound, unshakable calm settled over my shoulders. I realized in that exact moment that there was no magical future where my family would suddenly recognize my worth. There was no achievement grand enough, no sacrifice large enough to make them place me first. Even on my wedding day, mere minutes before I walked down the aisle, I was still an obstacle to their success. They would never prioritize me for a single second. The silence in the bridal suite stretched taut and fragile. Faintly through the thick walls of the conservatory, I could hear the string quartet begin to play a classical prelude. The guests were taking their seats. The clock on the vanity displayed 3:20. The seconds were ticking down an unstoppable march toward a confrontation they could not fathom. Patricia tapped her manicured fingernails against her leather handbag, waiting for my customary surrender. She expected me to pick up my phone, call the venue coordinator, and unravel the entire schedule to accommodate a phone call. I stood up from the velvet chair. The heavy silk of my gown rustled softly against the limestone floor. I did not feel anger. Anger requires a lingering investment in the other person's potential to change. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. The trap my father had built for himself was fully set, and my mother had just handed me the final piece. I turned my gaze away from the mirror and locked eyes with Patricia. I locked eyes with Patricia. The frantic, manic energy she radiated hit an invisible wall the second it met my gaze. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. "The music starts at 4 o'clock, I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of the old, eager-to-please tremor that had defined my childhood. "If Dad is busy with a phone call, he can stay in the lobby. We are not delaying the ceremony." Patricia blinked, her mouth falling open slightly. The command simply did not compute. In her curated universe, my father's corporate ambitions superseded the rotation of the earth itself. She stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. "Excuse me?" Patricia demanded. The shock morphed rapidly into indignation. Her grip tightened on the leather straps of her handbag. "You heard me, Mom. The schedule is set. The guests are seated. Lucas is waiting at the altar. I am not putting my life on hold for a real estate inquiry. If he cannot end a phone call for 10 minutes to see his daughter get married, he forfeits his seat." Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. She pushed herself away from the doorframe and crossed her arms, spilling a few drops of her mimosa onto the limestone floor. "Wow," Vanessa sneered. "We finally get a glimpse of the real Hazel. The sweet, modest routine was just an act. 5 minutes away from tying the knot with a nurse, and you are suddenly acting like a bridezilla. You are willing to sabotage a major contract for a walk down the aisle?" I turned my attention to my sister. "I am not sabotaging anything. I am walking down the aisle at the agreed time. You and Mom can decide where you want to be when that happens, but I am not waiting." Patricia's face flushed a deep mottled red. The mask of the poised Chicago socialite cracked, revealing the raw, unyielding selfishness beneath. She stepped closer, raising a finger to point directly at my face. "You are an ungrateful, selfish girl," Patricia hissed. Her voice vibrated with venom. "Your father has worked his entire life to provide for you. He has bent over backward to give you a comfortable life, and this is how you repay him? By throwing a tantrum over a schedule? You have no concept of how the real world operates. You have no idea what it takes to build a legacy." She was correct about one thing. I had no concept of their version of a legacy. Their legacy was built on hollow status, broken promises, and the quiet destruction of the people they claimed to love. My legacy was currently sitting in a secure server, preparing to dictate the future of urban infrastructure across Europe, drafted by the very girl she was calling selfish. 4 o'clock, I repeated. My tone was as solid as a concrete foundation. Patricia let out a sound of pure disgust. She spun on her heel, her designer shoes clicking sharply against the stone floor. "I am going to warn Richard," she spat over her shoulder. "I hope you are happy with yourself, Hazel. You are ruining this day for everyone." She stormed out of the bridal suite, leaving the door wide open. Vanessa lingered for a fraction of a second, offering me one final glare of utter contempt before following our mother down the corridor. The silence they left behind was profound. Sarah and Emily stepped forward, their faces pale with shock. Emily reached out gently, touching my arm. She offered to go after them to try and reason with Patricia, to find a compromise. I shook my head, offering my friends a reassuring smile. I thanked them for their fierce loyalty, but asked for a few moments alone before I made my entrance. They understood. They gave me a quick, tight hug and quietly exited the room to take their places near the front pews. I walked out of the suite and stepped into the dim, cavernous hallway outside the sanctuary doors. The air out here was cooler. The thick stone walls of the conservatory absorbed the ambient noise, leaving only the muffled, elegant strains of the string quartet drifting through the heavy oak doors separating me from the guests. I looked down at the glowing face of my smartwatch. It was exactly 3:55. I stood in the shadows listening to the gentle hum of conversations bleeding through the wood. In 5 minutes, the music would change. The doors would open. I was about to walk into a room filled with 150 people, and I was going to do it entirely alone. A year ago, the prospect of this isolation would have crushed me. I would have viewed my father's absence as a glaring public confirmation of my inadequacy. I would have felt the sting of rejection, assuming I had failed to earn his presence. I had spent my youth scanning the crowd at school plays and college graduations, perpetually waiting for a parent who always had a more important meeting to attend. But standing in the quiet corridor, enveloped in the soft tulle of my veil, I did not feel a trace of sorrow. I felt a breathtaking sense of liberation. Accepting the hollowness of my family was the most painful, clarifying experience of my life. They were not absent because I was unworthy of their time. They were absent because they lacked the capacity to value anything that did not directly inflate their own egos. Their absence was not a reflection of my value. It was a glaring indictment of their own spiritual poverty. I smoothed the silk fabric of my skirt. I did not need Richard Montgomery to give me away. A person can only be given away if they belong to someone else. I belonged to myself. I had built my own career, secured my own financial independence, and chosen a partner who cherished my substance over my status. Walking down that aisle alone was not a symbol of abandonment. It was a declaration of independence. The wedding coordinator, a brisk, efficient woman named Jessica, appeared from a side corridor. She wore a sleek black suit and held a clipboard tightly against her chest. A small earpiece rested in her right ear. She approached me with a hesitant, sympathetic expression, clearly aware of the drama unfolding in the lobby. "Hazel," Jessica whispered, her voice professional but gentle. "The prelude is wrapping up. I checked the front entrance. Your father is still on his phone call. Your mother is standing next to him. Do you want me to hold the musicians?" I looked at the heavy oak doors. Beyond them lay my future with a man who loved me for exactly who I was. I thought of Lucas standing at the altar, waiting for me with his steady, reassuring smile. He was the family I was choosing today. The people who abandoned me in the lobby no longer held any power over my joy. "No," I answered. My voice was clear and steady in the dim space. "Do not hold the musicians. I am ready." Jessica nodded, her expression shifting from sympathy to admiration. She lifted her hand, pressing a finger against her earpiece to communicate with the sound technician inside the sanctuary. "Cue the processional," Jessica instructed softly. Just as the words left her lips, a sound echoed through the quiet corridor. It was not the gentle swell of the string instruments. It was the heavy metallic clank of the venue's side entrance unlocking. This specific door was located at the far end of the hallway, a discreet access point generally reserved for staff members or high-security VIPs attempting to avoid the main public lobby. Jessica jumped, her head snapping toward the sound. I turned around, the fabric of my dress swirling gently around my ankles. The heavy metal door swung open, allowing a sudden, sharp shaft of afternoon sunlight to pierce the dim hallway. The dust motes danced in the bright beam. The atmosphere in the corridor shifted instantly, the air growing dense and charged with an unexpected presence. Footsteps echoed against the polished limestone floor. They were measured, deliberate, and unhurried. The sound carried a weight of authority that did not require shouting or frantic demands to be recognized. A man stepped into the corridor. He was tall, with silver hair perfectly combed back, projecting an aura of quiet, devastating power. He wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that commanded the space without demanding attention. Two men in dark conservative clothing flanked him, moving with the silent, watchful precision of highly trained security personnel. They stopped a few paces behind him, blending seamlessly into the shadows of the vestibule. The older man stepped fully into the light, bringing the weight of a corporate empire into the narrow hallway. It was Marcus Caldwell. Marcus Caldwell did not stride down the corridor with the hurried urgency of a corporate titan seizing a boardroom. He walked with the measured, grounded pace of a man entering a sacred space. His silver hair caught the dim, ambient light of the hallway, and the bespoke charcoal fabric of his suit seemed to absorb the shadows. The two security details faded back without a word, becoming part of the architecture, leaving only Marcus moving toward me. Jessica, the seasoned wedding coordinator, who had likely witnessed every conceivable permutation of bridal disaster, froze in her tracks. Her hand dropped slowly from her earpiece. The clipboard slipped a fraction of an inch down her chest. She recognized the man approaching us. Anyone who read the financial pages in Chicago knew the angular jawline and the piercing, intelligent eyes of the Caldwell Empire founder. I stood rooted to the limestone floor. My brain struggled to reconcile the intersecting worlds colliding in front of me. The man who dictated global investment strategies over encrypted lines at midnight was standing in a floral-scented corridor, looking at me in my white gown and tulle veil. He stopped 2 feet away. He did not look at me the way an employer examines an asset. He looked at me with profound, unvarnished respect. "I heard there was a vacancy for a steady arm," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that instantly settled the erratic beating of my heart. The sheer impossibility of his presence rendered me momentarily speechless. I had spent 2 years communicating with him through secure servers, drafting his vision into reality, earning his trust word by word. We had never shared a social engagement. Our relationship was built entirely on the architecture of language and strategy. Yet here he was, bypassing the velvet ropes of his own private universe to stand in the drafty hallway of a botanical conservatory. "Marcus?" I finally managed to whisper, my throat tight with a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. "What are you doing here?" He offered a small, knowing smile, the kind that usually preceded a brilliant, devastating move on the chessboard of his industry. "You told me last night that your father was choosing to sit in the back row to manage optics," Marcus replied, his tone conversational but laced with a sharp, protective edge. I decided that was an unacceptable arrangement, however. I needed to ensure Richard Montgomery remained out of your way this afternoon. I remembered Patricia bursting into the bridal suite, frantic about the high-stakes phone call my father was fielding in the lobby. The realization struck me like a physical force. "The Caldwell Holdings inquiry," I said, the pieces snapping together. "The senior vice president returning his call about the harbor redevelopment." Marcus nodded, his eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "My executive assistant is currently keeping Richard on a continuous, rotating hold. He was instructed to ask your father a series of highly detailed, redundant questions about zoning permits and environmental impact studies, interspersed with long pauses to consult fictional committees. Your father will likely pace that lobby for another 40 minutes, convinced he is negotiating the deal of his lifetime." A profound, resonant warmth bloomed in my chest. While my biological father was weaponizing his time, abandoning his daughter to chase a phantom corporate victory, the man he was trying to impress had orchestrated a masterclass in distraction just to protect my peace. "You flew here," I said, realizing the logistics involved in his sudden appearance. "You canceled your Friday schedule." "The schedule is irrelevant," Marcus said, his expression softening into something paternal and fierce. "Hazel, you have spent the last 24 months acting as the voice of my company. You have distilled my vision, managed my crises, and articulated the soul of my enterprise to the world. You operate in the shadows, letting others take the spotlight, asking for nothing but the opportunity to do excellent work." He stepped slightly closer, offering his arm. The fabric of his sleeve looked impeccably crisp. "A father is supposed to recognize the brilliance residing in his own home," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a gentle, steady timbre. "When a parent fails to see the substance of his child, it is his own tragic blindness. You are not a typist. You are not a disappointment. You are the most brilliant strategist I have ever encountered, and it would be the honor of my life to walk you toward your future." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, a sudden release of the tension I had carried since childhood. For 24 years I had craved this exact validation from Richard. I had contorted my personality, hidden my achievements, and accepted breadcrumbs of affection, all in the vain hope that my father would look at me with the pride Marcus was projecting right now. The grief of that realization washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a surging, unbreakable strength. Blood did not dictate loyalty. Love was an action, a choice, to show up when the stakes were high. The man offering his arm had no genetic obligation to me, yet he had traveled across the city to ensure I did not face a room full of people alone. I reached out and slipped my hand through the crook of his arm. The physical sensation was grounding. His arm was a solid, unyielding pillar of support. There was no hesitation, no reluctant obligation. He stood beside me, radiating a quiet, formidable certainty. "Thank you," I whispered, gripping his sleeve. It was a simple phrase, inadequate for the magnitude of the gesture, but it held every ounce of my gratitude. Marcus patted my hand, a brief, reassuring touch. "Save your thanks, Hazel. We have a room to enter. Keep your chin up. Let them see exactly who you are." I turned my attention back to Jessica. The wedding coordinator had watched the entire exchange with wide, disbelieving eyes. She had likely managed demanding mothers, intoxicated groomsmen, and vanishing vendors, but a billionaire executing a flawless decoy operation to stand in for a delinquent father was an unprecedented scenario. She recovered her composure with admirable speed. Jessica straightened her spine, her professional instincts overriding her shock. She looked at me, then at the towering figure of Marcus Caldwell, and offered a sharp, approving nod. She pressed her finger firmly against the earpiece. "Change of plans." Jessica whispered fiercely into the microphone. "The bride is ready. Cue the processional music. Open the doors on my mark." Through the thick oak panels, the faint ambient chatter of the seated guests abruptly ceased. A brief, pregnant silence filled the sanctuary. Then, the rich, resonant vibration of a cello filled the air, joined immediately by the bright, soaring notes of a violin. The string quartet struck the first defining chord of the bridal march. The music was not a gentle, hesitant melody. It was a triumphant, sweeping arrangement, building in intensity with every passing second. The tempo echoed the frantic, exhilarating rhythm of my own pulse. I looked straight ahead at the seam where the two heavy doors met. On the other side of that wood, my father was sitting in the back row, confident in his narrative of my failure. He believed he had successfully diminished my presence. He believed he controlled the board. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked quietly beside me, adjusting his stance to perfectly match my pace. I felt the sheer tulle of the veil brush against my shoulders. I felt the solid weight of the floor beneath my satin shoes. I thought of Lucas standing at the altar, waiting for me to step into the light. I thought of the empire I had built in the shadows, the power I wielded with a keystroke, and the unbreakable boundary I had finally drawn in the sand. "I have never been more ready in my life," I answered. Jessica gripped the polished brass handles of the double doors. She looked over her shoulder, meeting my gaze one last time. She did not ask for permission. She simply read the unwavering resolve etched across my face. With a swift, practiced motion, Jessica pushed down on the handles and threw the heavy oak doors wide open. Inside the conservatory, the afternoon sun filtered through thousands of individual glass panes, creating a brilliant, glowing canopy overhead. The light struck the pale limestone pathways, illuminating the vibrant green of towering palm fronds and rare exotic orchids spilling from elevated planters. The air was thick with the sweet, heady scent of jasmine and damp earth. 150 guests sat on dark wooden chairs, arranged in perfectly straight rows, separated by a wide, pristine center aisle. A low, persistent hum of conversation hovered in the humid air, a mingling of two distinct worlds forced into the same enclosed space. On the right side of the aisle sat the O'Connor family and their close friends. They leaned across empty seats to greet cousins they had not seen in months, passing tissues back and forth, sharing quiet, genuine laughter. They wore comfortable, modest suits and sensible dresses purchased for the occasion. They exuded a warmth that filled their half of the room, treating the wedding as a sacred, joyous reunion. On the left side sat the Montgomery contingent. These were the power brokers of the Chicago real estate market, the developers, the bankers, and the corporate lawyers. They wore bespoke Italian wool sharp tailoring and diamond tennis bracelets that caught the sunlight. They did not lean across the aisle to socialize or share memories. They calculated. They assessed the soaring floral arrangements and silently estimated the cost per stem, viewing the entire ceremony as a networking mixer with a mandated dress code. They exchanged business cards with practiced discretion, keeping their voices pitched to a low, guarded murmur. Just as the string quartet began tuning their instruments, Richard strode into the sanctuary. He did not slip through the entrance quietly to avoid drawing focus, nor did he offer an apologetic nod to the ushers. He walked with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man accustomed to halting boardroom discussions the moment he arrived. He looked profoundly annoyed. His face held a tight, pinched expression, the residual frustration of spending the last 40 minutes on hold in the lobby, trapped in a cyclical conversation with a phantom executive assistant. He navigated toward the back of the room, deliberately ignoring the empty seat of honor reserved for him in the front row. Patricia was already seated there, twisting a delicate silk handkerchief in her lap, her eyes darting nervously toward the entrance. She had saved the chair beside her, expecting him to join her after securing his corporate victory. Instead, Richard slid into the very last row, dropping heavily into a wooden chair next to Vanessa. Vanessa barely looked up from the glowing screen of her phone. She wore her slate gray dress like a suit of armor, radiating a cold, detached boredom. She crossed her legs, adjusting the hem of her skirt, making it clear to anyone watching that she was merely fulfilling a tedious familial obligation. Richard settled into his seat beside her, shooting his cuffs with a sharp flick of his wrist to reveal a heavy platinum timepiece. He tapped the crystal face with his index finger, projecting the image of a corporate titan whose valuable schedule was being horribly mismanaged by an incompetent subordinate. Seated directly across the narrow aisle from Richard was Gregory Vance, a senior partner at a prominent commercial investment bank. Gregory was a key figure in the harbor redevelopment project, a man my father desperately needed to impress to secure his next round of funding. Richard noticed Gregory looking his way. Richard leaned across the empty space, offering a conspiratorial, tight-lipped smile. "Apologies for the delay, Greg," Richard whispered, his voice pitched to carry just far enough to be heard by the surrounding investors. "Hazel is always a bit disorganized. Getting her down the aisle on a schedule requires a great deal of patience. I had to step out to handle a crisis because things were falling apart behind the scenes." He delivered the lie with effortless precision. He painted himself as the long-suffering patriarch dealing with a chaotic, ungrateful child, thereby excusing his position in the back row. He framed his refusal to escort his daughter as a noble sacrifice of his own time, a necessary consequence of her own supposed incompetence. Gregory offered a polite, understanding nod, returning his attention to the front of the room. Richard settled back in his chair, deeply satisfied with his performance. He believed he had successfully neutralized the situation. He had protected Vanessa from the sight of a traditional father-daughter march, maintained his corporate dignity, and secured his victim narrative for the elite guests seated nearby. He was entirely blind to the trap he had constructed for himself. He assumed his power in this room was unquestionable. He was ignorant of the fact that the actual epicenter of Chicago influence, the man he had spent 10 years chasing, was currently standing in the hallway outside, holding his daughter's arm. At the front of the conservatory, beneath a soaring arch woven with white roses and thick green ivy, stood Lucas. He wore a sharp, classic black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hands were clasped in front of him. He looked down the long, empty center aisle, his eyes fixed firmly on the heavy oak doors at the rear of the sanctuary. He looked nervous, but it was not the nervous energy of a man doubting his choice. It was the fierce, electric anticipation of a man waiting for his life to officially begin. He shifted his weight slightly, offering a quick, reassuring smile to his mother Martha, who was already dabbing her eyes with the tissue in the second row. Lucas did not care about the bespoke suits on the left side of the room. He did not care about my father sitting in the back row projecting disdain. He only cared about the woman standing on the other side of that wood. He loved me for the quiet strength I possessed, a strength my family had spent years trying to break. He knew the emotional toll this day had taken on me, and he stood ready to anchor me the moment I reached his side. He represented a future built on partnership and mutual respect, a stark contrast to the transactional relationships that defined the Montgomery household. The ambient chatter in the room gradually faded into a heavy, expectant silence. The rustling of silk dresses and the clearing of throats ceased. The string quartet shifted their sheet music on their metal stands. The cellist raised his bow, hovering it just above the strings. The first resonant chord of the processional echoed through the glass cathedral, vibrating against the limestone floors and soaring up into the glass canopy. The music swelled, filling the vast space with a rich, triumphant melody. The notes were clear and bold, demanding the attention of every person present. The tension in the room escalated into an agonizing physical presence. The elite guests, many of whom owed their fortunes to the fluctuating tides of the city market, turned their heads in unison to face the back of the conservatory. Richard shifted in his wooden seat, his lips curling into a faint, arrogant smirk. He looked up, fixing his gaze on the polished brass handles of the double doors. He expected to see his youngest daughter step into the light alone. He anticipated a pathetic display of isolation, a visual confirmation that without his financial backing and social endorsement, I was nothing. He was ready to watch me walk a long, humiliating path, stripped of my confidence, bearing the full weight of his rejection in front of his peers. He wanted the room to feel pity for the girl abandoned by her own father. He imagined the hushed whispers of his colleagues, the subtle nods of understanding as they witnessed my solitary march. He believed this moment would solidify his dominance, proving once and for all that defying his demands carried a steep public price. The heavy oak doors at the back of the conservatory began to swing inward. The bright afternoon sunlight pierced the threshold, casting a long, blinding beam down the center aisle. Richard leaned forward slightly, waiting for his orchestrated victory to unfold. The heavy oak doors swung inward, yielding to the brisk push of the venue coordinator. A brilliant wash of afternoon sunlight poured through the threshold, catching the fine mist of the indoor botanical garden and creating a soft, glowing halo in the entryway. I stepped forward, my satin shoes gliding onto the smooth limestone path. My right hand rested securely in the crook of Marcus Caldwell's tailored charcoal sleeve. The rich, soaring melody of the string quartet filled the glass cathedral, echoing against the soaring vaulted ceiling. The congregation rose to their feet in a synchronized wave, a sea of rustling fabric and scraping wooden chairs. On the right side of the center aisle, the O'Connor family turned with bright, expectant smiles. Martha pressed a crumpled tissue to her cheek, her eyes shining with genuine joy. Tom offered a wide, approving grin, placing a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder. They saw a bride preparing to join their family. They recognized the profound happiness radiating from my posture, unbothered by the identity of the distinguished older gentleman escorting me. On the left side of the aisle, the reality of the situation unfolded at a drastically different pace. The power brokers of the Chicago real estate market, the investment bankers, and the corporate attorneys turned their heads expecting to fulfill a tedious social obligation. For a fraction of a second, they exhibited the standard polite reverence reserved for a wedding march. Then their practiced gazes shifted from my white gown and tulle veil to the man walking beside me. Marcus possessed a striking, undeniable presence. He was a titan who dictated their fiscal realities from a fortified penthouse boardroom. He was a ghost in their social circles, a man who famously avoided galas, charity mixers, and networking events. Most of the executives in this room had spent their careers analyzing his market predictions, attempting to decode his investment strategies, and praying for an introduction. Yet here he was, walking with measured, unhurried grace down the aisle of a mid-tier botanical conservatory. The recognition struck the corporate guests like a physical blow. A collective, audible intake of breath rippled through the rows of bespoke suits and designer dresses. It was not a polite, celebratory murmur. It was a visceral, involuntary gasp of pure astonishment. Gregory Vance, the senior partner seated across from my family, lowered his embossed ceremony program, his eyes widening in profound disbelief. Frantic, hushed whispers ignited across the left side of the sanctuary, sweeping through the corporate ranks like a sudden brush fire. In the very last row, my father's meticulously calculated reality disintegrated. The smug patrician smirk he had worn moments prior vanished. The blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a stark, terrifying shade of ash white. He leaned forward, his knuckles turning pale as he gripped the carved wooden edge of the pew in front of him. His jaw dropped, pulling his features into an expression of raw, unguarded panic. Richard stared at Marcus, then darted his gaze to me, then snapped back to the billionaire. The mental arithmetic broke his cognitive processing. He had spent 10 years and thousands of dollars chasing this exact man. He had sent expensive gifts, purchased VIP tables, and leveraged every contact in his phone just to secure a 5-minute introductory meeting. He had spent the last 40 minutes pacing a lobby, desperately trying to impress a mid-level assistant at Caldwell Holdings. Now the founder of that empire was gently escorting his youngest daughter down the center aisle, the same daughter Richard introduced to his colleagues as a freelance typist, the daughter he deemed a social liability, the daughter he had refused to walk, citing bad optics. The sheer crushing irony of the scene paralyzed him. He was anchored to a back row chair, suddenly aware that he had voluntarily severed himself from the single most powerful connection in his entire industry. Beside him, Vanessa underwent a similar, devastating metamorphosis. She had spent the morning dictating my appearance, striving to ensure my wedding remained a meager shadow of her own canceled high society affair. She had mocked my schedule, sipping a mimosa while calling me a bridezilla. As she registered the identity of my escort, her rigid, defensive posture crumbled. Her phone slipped from her grasp, tumbling onto the hard limestone floor with a sharp, echoing clatter. She did not reach down to retrieve it. Her meticulously cultivated apathy shattered. She stared at me, her eyes wide, attempting to reconcile the plain, unassuming sister she mocked with the poised woman commanding the attention of Chicago's most elusive power broker. The slate-gray dress she wore to signal her boredom now felt profoundly foolish. Her smug superiority dissolved into unadulterated shock. Marcus set a measured, deliberate pace, ignoring the frantic whispers swirling around us. We approached the back row. Richard opened his mouth, leaning slightly into the aisle, perhaps intending to utter a desperate greeting or salvage some fragment of his shattered dignity. He raised a trembling hand. Marcus did not turn his head. He did not blink. He looked straight ahead, treating my father with the most devastating response a man of his stature could deliver: total, unbroken indifference. We glided past the final row, leaving Richard suspended in mid-gesture. My father was rendered invisible in front of every peer he desperately wished to impress. As we progressed down the limestone path, I felt the gaze of every investor and developer lock onto me. They were recalibrating my value in real time. A few hours ago, I was Richard Montgomery's disappointing offspring, a girl marrying a nurse. Now I was the woman holding the arm of the kingmaker. The whispers shifted from confusion to intense calculating curiosity. They wondered what secret leverage I possessed. They wondered how the quiet girl in the walk-up apartment had secured the loyalty of a billionaire. I kept my posture flawless. I elevated my chin, wearing the cathedral-length veil my sister tried to forbid. I did not look at the corporate guests. I did not care about their sudden reverence or their calculating stares. My validation did not come from their hushed awe. At the end of the aisle, beneath a soaring arch woven with white roses, stood Lucas. His presence cut through the chaotic, shifting energy of the room. He wore his classic black tuxedo with a quiet, grounded confidence. He did not look at the towering titan of industry holding my arm. He did not scan the crowd to gauge the reaction of the wealthy executives. His eyes were fixed solely on my face. A broad, brilliant smile broke across his features, reaching all the way to his eyes. The fierce anticipation he held moments prior melted into profound relief and deep, abiding joy. He saw the woman he loved, the partner who shared his quiet evenings and matched his steadfast loyalty. The staggering wealth and intimidating status radiating from my escort meant nothing to him. He was unbothered by the spectacle, untouched by the corporate theatrics playing out in the pews. He was simply a man watching his future walk toward him, and in his steady gaze I found the only approval I would ever need. We reached the altar, halting just before the short flight of steps leading to the officiant. The string quartet allowed the final note of the processional to fade into a resonant, lingering echo. Marcus released my arm. He turned to me, his expression softening from the formidable corporate titan into something remarkably tender. He leaned in and pressed a brief, affectionate kiss to my cheek. He then turned his attention to the man standing in front of us. Marcus extended his hand. Lucas met his grip without hesitation. The exchange was silent, but carried immense weight. Two men from vastly different universes bridged a wide socio-economic divide through a shared fundamental respect for the woman standing between them. Marcus offered a firm nod of approval, conveying a wealth of unspoken endorsement. With his duty fulfilled, Marcus stepped back. He did not retreat to the perimeter or blend into the standing security detail waiting near the exit. He turned and glided directly toward the very first row on the left side of the aisle. This was the designated seat of honor. Patricia sat there, clutching her silk handkerchief, guarding the empty chair Richard had abandoned for the sake of optics. Marcus bypassed the ushers and lowered himself into the vacant seat beside my mother. I stood beside Lucas, turning my focus to the officiant, but the peripheral energy in the conservatory was palpable. The air crackled with the silent seismic shockwaves of my escort choosing that specific chair. Patricia was trapped. The woman who had spent 45 minutes frantic over a phone call with a Caldwell Holdings subordinate was now sharing an armrest with the founder of the company. I could hear the erratic, shallow rhythm of her breathing from the altar. She was hyperventilating in a designer dress, paralyzed by proximity to the power she worshipped, terrified to speak, and unable to flee. The ceremony began. The officiant welcomed the guests, speaking of partnership and enduring commitment. The words echoed gracefully under the soaring glass canopy. Sunlight continued to pour through the orchids, warming the limestone floor beneath my shoes. Lucas held both of my hands, his thumbs tracing the lace cuffs of my gown. His gaze was a steady, grounding force, anchoring me in the present moment. Yet beneath the serene surface of the ritual, a silent, psychological execution was taking place in the final row of the sanctuary. I did not need to turn my head to witness my father losing his grip on reality. I had spent 24 years studying his reactions, learning to anticipate his moods by the tightening of his jaw or the shift in his posture. I knew the exact agonizing arithmetic currently misfiring in his brain. Richard was sitting in the back, sweating through his tailored wool suit. The bespoke fabric, chosen to project dominance, had become a suffocating prison. He was frantically attempting to reverse engineer my existence. He was sifting through memories of my modest apartment, my quiet evenings, the closed laptop screens, and the generic descriptions of my freelance typing career. He had mocked my income. He had weaponized his wealth to strip away my venue funding, assuming I possessed no capital of my own. Now he was forced to reconcile his assumptions with the staggering reality unfolding before him. He was trying to calculate how a daughter he deemed a social liability possessed the leverage to summon Marcus Caldwell to a botanical garden on a Friday afternoon. The true agony for my father was not simply discovering his own ignorance. The torture lay in the public broadcast of his irrelevance. Richard had chosen that specific seat in the back row to send a message to his peers. He wanted to signal his superiority, to demonstrate that his daughter marrying a pediatric nurse was beneath his active participation. He intended to project the image of a busy, important man indulging a chaotic child. Instead, he had publicly amputated himself from my success. Gregory Vance and the other prominent investors seated nearby had witnessed the entire sequence. They saw Marcus Caldwell escort me down the aisle. They saw Marcus take the seat of honor, and they saw Richard Montgomery, the man constantly begging for their capital, exiled to the furthest corner of the room by his own arrogant design. My father had loudly advertised to the most influential people in Chicago that he had zero connection to the epicenter of power. He was severed from the dynamic he worshipped, exposed as an outsider in his own family. Beside him, Vanessa was enduring her own profound humiliation. The slate-gray dress she wore to signal her boredom now served as camouflage, allowing her to shrink into the shadows of the back pew. She had spent the morning dictating my appearance, forbidding a veil, desperate to ensure my wedding remained a meager shadow of her canceled high society affair. Her former fiancé, a mid-tier hedge fund manager, was a microscopic entity compared to the Caldwell empire. Her smug superiority had evaporated, replaced by a crushing, mortifying realization that her sister operated at a tier she could not even comprehend. I let the image of their panic dissolve, returning my full attention to the man holding my hands. The officiant invited us to share our vows. We had chosen to write our own, bypassing the traditional scripts for words that reflected our actual journey. Lucas spoke first. His voice carried a rich, soothing timbre that resonated through the quiet conservatory. He did not speak of grand sweeping fairy tales or superficial milestones. He spoke of my resilience. He promised to be a sanctuary, a place where I never had to shrink to fit a predefined mold. He vowed to honor my quiet strength, to stand beside me in the shadows, and to celebrate me in the light. He spoke of building a home founded on truth, mutual respect, and enduring safety. His words were a balm, healing the residual bruises left by decades of familial neglect. Tears spilled over my lower lashes, trailing down my cheeks. I did not bother to wipe them away. When it was my turn, I looked into his eyes and spoke from the deepest, most authentic part of my soul. I promised to protect our peace with the same fierce dedication I applied to my work. I vowed to never measure our worth by external validation or hollow status symbols. I promised to cherish the simple, profound joy of our shared life, prioritizing our bond above any corporate ambition or social expectation. I told him he was my chosen family, my anchor, and my greatest victory. The exchange of rings was seamless, a physical manifestation of the unbreakable boundary I had drawn between my past and my future. The cool metal slid onto my finger, securing a promise that my family could never tarnish. The officiant offered a final, resonant blessing. He instructed Lucas to kiss the bride. Lucas pulled me close, his hands resting gently on my waist. The kiss was not a theatrical performance for the crowd. It was tender, deep, and grounded in a quiet, unshakable certainty. We pulled back, sharing a private smile that communicated volumes. We had survived the gauntlet, and we had emerged victorious. The officiant turned to the congregation, his voice ringing out with joyous authority. He presented us to the room for the very first time. The applause began immediately. It did not originate from the back rows or the corporate contingent. The sound erupted from the right side of the aisle, initiated by the O'Connor family. It was raucous, genuine, and filled with unfiltered delight. Martha was cheering openly, waving her tissue in the air. Tom clapped his calloused hands together, his face beaming with pride. Slowly, the applause spread across the center aisle, infecting the left side of the sanctuary. The investors, the bankers, and the developers joined the celebration. Their clapping was polite, measured, and calculated, a necessary social function required by the presence of Marcus Caldwell in the front row. They were applauding out of obligation to power, while my new family applauded out of abundant love. I slipped my hand into the grip of my new husband. We turned to face the congregation, preparing to walk back up the aisle as a united front. The music swelled once more, a bright, energetic composition signaling the beginning of the reception. We took our first steps together, leaving the altar behind. I kept my head high, my vision fixed on the exit, ready to face whatever desperate maneuvers my father would attempt next. The transition from the sanctuary to the reception hall felt like crossing a border into a different climate. The sun had dipped below the jagged Chicago skyline, replacing the bright afternoon glare with a soft twilight glow that painted the glass ceiling of the conservatory in shades of deep indigo. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts wove seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays adorned with flutes of champagne and intricate hors d'oeuvres. A jazz trio played a lively, upbeat tempo near the edge of the dance floor, filling the humid, floral-scented air with a celebratory rhythm. Lucas and I stood near a towering arrangement of ancient ferns surrounded by Sarah Emily and a tight circle of off-duty pediatric nurses from his hospital wing. It was a pocket of genuine, unfiltered joy. The nurses recounted stories of Lucas's legendary patients on the ward, pulling laughter from my chest that felt light and unburdened. For the first time in my life, a social gathering did not feel like a battlefield I had to navigate for my family's benefit. Across the room, the corporate contingent was still struggling to recalibrate. The real estate developers and investment bankers clustered in small, tight groups near the glowing amber lights of the mahogany bar. They murmured behind their cocktail glasses, their eyes constantly tracking my movements. They were attempting to decode the new hierarchy, trying to understand how the unassuming bride had secured the allegiance of a billionaire. But no one was analyzing the room with more frantic intensity than Richard Montgomery. I watched my father through a narrow gap in the crowd. The initial paralyzing shock of the ceremony had worn off, replaced by the churning, relentless machinery of his ego. A narcissist cannot survive in a vacuum of irrelevance. When confronted with a reality that diminishes them, they must immediately rewrite the script to cast themselves back in the starring role. Richard was currently drafting his revision. He could not accept that he had been sidelined. He needed to reclaim the narrative, to twist Marcus Caldwell's presence into a testament to his own influence. Richard scanned the room, his eyes darting past the floral centerpieces until he spotted his target. Marcus stood near the far end of the bar, holding a simple tumbler of sparkling water, speaking quietly with the venue manager. Richard moved. He reached out and grabbed Patricia by the elbow, pulling her alongside him with a sharp, insistent tug. My mother stumbled slightly in her designer heels, her composure fracturing. The color had not returned to her face since Marcus had claimed the seat beside her during the vows. Patricia understood the unspoken, ruthless rules of Chicago society far better than her husband. You do not ambush apex predators when they are off the clock. Her eyes darted around the room, frantic and pleading, desperate to avoid the impending collision. She tried to plant her feet, but Richard's grip on her arm was unyielding. He dragged her forward like a prop. I felt a cold prickle of adrenaline crawl up my spine. For a decade, I had watched my father corner executives at country club dinners and charity galas. He wielded his forceful charm like a blunt instrument, compelling meetings that no one wanted to take, using basic social obligations as leverage to trap his targets. The childhood reflex to manage the situation flared in my chest. A phantom anxiety urged me to cross the floor to intercept him, to protect my boss from my family's tacky, transparent desperation. Lucas felt the subtle shift in my posture. He stepped closer, resting a warm, heavy hand on my lower back, grounding me in the present reality. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the scent of jasmine fill my lungs. I did not need to run interference. I was no longer the frightened girl tasked with keeping the peace at the expense of my own dignity. I stayed exactly where I was, sipping my champagne, and watched the execution unfold from a safe distance. Richard approached the bar, with his shoulders squared and his chest puffed out, inflating his physical presence to mask his insecurity. He plastered on his signature church handshake smile. It was a wide, practiced grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes, but remained entirely devoid of warmth. It was the smile he reserved for closing difficult deals and charming hesitant lenders. He stepped directly into Marcus's personal space, pulling a rigid, terrified Patricia into the spotlight with him. "Marcus?" Richard called out. His voice boomed over the low hum of the reception, deliberately pitched to ensure the surrounding investors could hear the familiar tone. "What a surprise to see you here, supporting my little girl." He extended his right hand, waiting for the customary firm shake of a mutual colleague. It was a breathtaking pivot. By calling me his little girl, Richard was attempting to co-opt the moment. He was framing Marcus's attendance as a personal favor to the Montgomery family, a testament to Richard's own social gravity. He was pretending the deliberate public insult in the back row had never occurred. He was acting as if they were old friends, running into each other at a golf course. Marcus did not take the offered hand. The billionaire stood perfectly still. His posture was relaxed, but radiated a commanding, lethal authority. He slowly lowered his gaze, looking at Richard's outstretched palm. He did not yell, he did not scowl, he did not offer a verbal reprimand. He merely observed the hand as if it were something foul, a piece of spoiled meat resting on a pristine dining table. Richard's smile faltered. The corners of his mouth trembled as the sheer weight of the rejection settled over him. The silence between the two men stretched thick and unyielding. The surrounding corporate guests, noticing the interaction, fell deathly quiet. They watched the titan of their industry dismantle a local developer without uttering a single syllable. The silence was louder than a shout. Patricia looked like she wanted the limestone floor to open up and swallow her whole. She stared at her own shoes, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the vicinity. Desperate to salvage the interaction, driven by blind ego, Richard plunged forward, ignoring the devastating social cues. He dropped his hand, cleared his throat, and shifted seamlessly into a sales pitch. "I have been meaning to get on your calendar for months, Marcus." Richard pressed on the volume of his voice, rising to compensate for the crushing awkwardness. "We have a commercial property development in the downtown sector. It is prime real estate with high yield projections. We have the zoning locked down. It aligns perfectly with Caldwell Holdings' fourth quarter acquisition targets. I would love to sit down next week, grab a quick lunch, and run the numbers by your team." He was pitching a substandard commercial strip to a man who shaped skylines and dictated global market trends. He was executing this maneuver at his daughter's wedding reception, mere hours after refusing to walk her down the aisle. The sheer, unvarnished greed of the act was staggering. I watched Marcus Caldwell process the pitch. The older man tilted his head a fraction of an inch, assessing the hollow, desperate shell of a man standing before him. Marcus knew every detail of Richard's mediocre portfolio. He knew about the cheap materials, the corner cutting, and the frantic attempts to secure capital. More importantly, he knew the exact psychological warfare Richard had waged against me to protect his own vanity. The ambient noise in the conservatory shifted. The lively jazz music playing through the sound system smoothly faded out, signaling a transition in the evening schedule. The venue coordinator stepped up to the edge of the dance floor, tapping a microphone to command the attention of the room. Marcus did not offer Richard a rejection. A verbal rejection would imply that the proposal was worthy of consideration, that they were operating on the same professional plane. Instead, Marcus offered him nothing. He turned his back on my father. It was a fluid, dismissive motion that severed the interaction entirely, erasing Richard from his field of vision. Richard was left standing near the bar, his mouth slightly open, his pitch hanging dead in the chilled air. The surrounding corporate guests quickly averted their eyes, deeply embarrassed by the raw public display of a man overplaying a hand he did not even hold. Patricia finally pulled her arm free from his grasp, taking a wide, hurried step away from him, desperate to distance herself from the radioactive fallout of his humiliation. Marcus Caldwell walked away from the bar with unhurried grace. He approached the center of the room, reaching out to take the microphone from the coordinator. The remaining chatter in the hall evaporated instantly. 150 guests turned their undivided attention to the front of the room, leaving Richard isolated, exposed, and terribly awkward in the shadows. Marcus stepped into the center of the reception hall. He held the microphone in his right hand and a crystal glass of sparkling water in his left. He did not tap the microphone to command attention. He did not issue a loud, boisterous greeting. He merely stood there, projecting a quiet, insurmountable authority. The lingering conversations among the corporate guests extinguished instantly. The clinking of silverware against porcelain faded into a breathless hush. 150 people turned their undivided focus toward the floor, waiting for the elusive billionaire to speak. I stood beside Lucas near the edge of the dance floor. My pulse hummed a steady, calm rhythm. I felt no urge to intercept the moment or soften the impending blow. I rested my hand on my husband's arm, watching the architect of my professional life prepare to dismantle the fictional hierarchy my family had spent decades building. A wedding is a public declaration of a private truth, Marcus began. His voice resonated through the sound system, rich and measured, rolling across the room with the effortless cadence of a man accustomed to being heard. We gather today to witness the foundation of a new family. We are here to celebrate two people who recognize the rare, enduring substance in one another. Marcus turned his head slightly, offering a warm, genuine smile to Lucas. Marcus continued. I had the privilege of speaking with you briefly before the ceremony. It is rare to meet a man who navigates his life with such clear, unpretentious purpose. You dedicate your days to healing children. You operate in environments where the stakes are genuine and the margins for error are razor thin. You do not demand the spotlight. You simply do the essential, grueling work that holds communities together. You saw the brilliance in Hazel long before the rest of the world caught on, and you offered her a partnership built on mutual respect. You are an exceptional man. She chose well. Lucas offered a humble, grateful nod, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer to his side. A ripple of genuine warmth spread through the O'Connor family tables. They beamed with pride, validated by the towering figure standing before them. Then Marcus shifted his gaze. He looked out over the sea of bespoke suits and designer dresses on the left side of the room. The warmth slowly drained from his features, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus of a corporate titan preparing to lay his cards on the table. Most of you in this room know my reputation, Marcus stated, his tone dropping into a cooler, more clinical register. I do not attend social functions. I avoid galas. I prefer to let my work speak for itself. I am standing in this room tonight for one specific reason. He paused, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room grew brittle. I am here to honor the woman in the white dress, Marcus said. A faint, uncertain murmur drifted through the ranks of the Chicago elite. They glanced at me, their eyes sweeping over my simple gown and classic veil, struggling to reconcile my unassuming presence with the gravity of his endorsement. For the past 2 years, Caldwell Holdings has executed a series of highly successful, complex global initiatives, Marcus explained, his voice echoing clearly across the conservatory. We navigated intricate zoning disputes. We shifted our portfolio towards sustainable urban infrastructure. We authored the policies that are currently redefining the commercial real estate market across 3 continents. He took a slow sip from his crystal glass, letting the weight of his achievement settle over the crowd. The executives nodded in quiet agreement. They knew the initiatives well. Many of them had lost significant capital trying to compete with the very strategies he was referencing. I did not draft those initiatives alone, Marcus revealed. The visionary behind our most pivotal public maneuvers, the author of the keynotes that drive our market share, the voice shaping the soul of my enterprise, is standing right there. He extended a hand toward me. Hazel Montgomery is my most trusted strategist, Marcus declared. The revelation hit the corporate guests like a physical shockwave. The math finally clicked into place. The men and women who had spent the afternoon dismissing me as a modest, unremarkable bride were suddenly staring at the shadow architect of the Caldwell empire. They realized the girl my father introduced as a freelance typist was actually the quiet force outmaneuvering their firms on a daily basis. Gregory Vance, the senior partner my father desperately needed, dropped his gaze to the floor, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. The hushed whispers ignited once more, a frantic, scrambling attempt to process the new reality. I kept my posture straight, absorbing the public validation without a trace of arrogance. I did not need their awe, but I allowed the truth to wash over the room, washing away 24 years of manufactured invisibility. Marcus let the realization steep. He waited until the whispers subsided and the hall returned to a tense, expectant silence. Then the atmosphere shifted. The temperature in the room plummeted. Marcus lowered his glass, his posture hardening into a stance of formidable, lethal precision. He looked past the tables. He looked past the dance floor. He locked his eyes on the shadowed corner near the mahogany bar, pinning my father in place. Richard was still standing where Marcus had abandoned him. He was frozen, his face devoid of color, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He was watching his entire constructed universe disintegrate in real time. "A father's job is to recognize the brilliance residing in his own house," Marcus said. He did not shout. He did not raise his volume. He delivered the sentence with a quiet, devastating finality that carried to the furthest corners of the reception hall. "When a man chooses to sit in the back," Marcus continued, his eyes boring into Richard, "he loses the right to stand in the front when the world applauds her." It was a flawless surgical strike. Marcus had not merely insulted my father, he had exposed the hollow, pathetic core of Richard's entire existence. He laid bare the cruelty of a parent who prioritized his own vanity over his child, and he did it in front of every single person whose opinion Richard valued. The elite guests turned their heads slowly, following the trajectory of Marcus's gaze. They stared at Richard Montgomery. A few hours prior, they might have humored his excuses. They might have believed his narrative of the chaotic, disorganized daughter. But now, armed with the truth, they looked at him with open, unvarnished pity and profound disgust. In the cutthroat circles of Chicago real estate, ruthlessness was often tolerated, but stupidity was unforgivable. Richard was suddenly unmasked as both a terrible father and a catastrophic businessman. He had spent a decade begging for a meeting with Caldwell Holdings, burning through capital to secure an introduction, entirely oblivious to the fact that his own daughter held the keys to the kingdom. He had mocked her income, stripped her of her wedding funding, and refused to walk her down the aisle, alienating the one person who could have granted his deepest professional desires. The corporate sharks in the room recognized a fatal error when they saw one. They realized that associating with Richard was a liability. He possessed no insight, no judgment, and no real influence. He was a man who pitched a substandard commercial strip to a billionaire just moments after publicly humiliating the billionaire's top strategist. Richard shrank under the collective weight of their stares. His shoulders slumped, the arrogant posture dissolving into a tragic, defeated slouch. He opened his mouth, searching for a defense, a witty pivot, or a plausible excuse. He found nothing. The silence suffocated him. He was trapped in the back of the room, exactly where he had chosen to be. Near the bar, Patricia pressed a hand against her chest, her eyes wide with horror. She took another distinct step away from her husband, physically severing herself from his ruined reputation. Vanessa sat at a nearby table, her face buried in her hands entirely, unable to withstand the social execution unfolding around her. Marcus Caldwell raised his crystal glass one final time. He broke eye contact with my father, dismissing him entirely, and turned his warm, approving gaze back to the dance floor. "To Hazel and Lucas," Marcus toasted, his voice ringing with genuine celebration. "May you build a legacy that outlasts the noise." The room erupted into applause. It was thunderous, eager, and unanimous. The guests raised their glasses, desperate to align themselves with the winning side of the board. The jazz trio immediately struck up a lively, triumphant melody, breaking the tension and ushering the reception into a new, vibrant chapter. Marcus handed the microphone back to the coordinator and walked back to his table, leaving a shattered paradigm in his wake. I leaned into Lucas, feeling a profound, sweeping sense of relief. The heavy, suffocating armor I had worn my entire life fell away, leaving me light and entirely free. We turned toward the dance floor, ready to celebrate, knowing the final, desperate confrontation was still waiting in the wings. The reception was 2 hours underway, and the atmosphere in the main hall had transformed. The formal dinner had concluded, plates were cleared away by silent waitstaff, and the mellow jazz trio had surrendered the stage to a vibrant, energetic soul band. Lucas was currently swept into the center of the dance floor by his mother Martha. She spun him to a lively rhythm, while his cousins formed a cheering, clapping circle around them. The air felt buoyant, light, and wonderfully liberated. The heavy, suffocating corporate tension that defined the early evening had evaporated the moment my father was publicly humiliated. Several of the elite executives had quietly slipped out the side doors, unwilling to share a room with a man who had become a walking cautionary tale. The investors who stayed gravitated toward the open bar, maintaining a wide, deliberate berth around my family. I needed a moment to breathe. The tulle of my veil felt a bit warm under the ambient canopy lights, and my throat was dry from hours of constant smiling and talking. I squeezed Lucas's shoulder as he stepped off the dance floor, signaling I was heading to the restroom to touch up my hair. I navigated through the joyous crowd, leaving the loud brass section behind. The music faded to a dull, rhythmic thumping as I stepped into the dim limestone corridor leading toward the powder rooms. The air out here was cool and still. Antique sconces cast soft scalloped shadows along the stone walls, offering a quiet respite from the celebration. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the serenity settle over my shoulders. "Hazel!" The voice was sharp, a harsh, frantic whisper cutting through the quiet hallway. I opened my eyes and stopped walking. Richard Montgomery stepped out from an alcove near the restroom entrance, moving to block my path. Vanessa followed a second later, hovering just behind his shoulder, stepping into the dim light. They looked terrible. The polished, invincible armor they wore into the conservatory had fractured, leaving them disheveled and exposed. My father had unbuttoned his bespoke suit jacket, and his silk tie was pulled loose, hanging slightly askew. A fine sheen of perspiration coated his forehead. He looked his age, suddenly fragile and drowning in his own panic. Vanessa stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her slate-gray dress wrinkled at the waist. Her eye makeup was slightly smudged, a clear indication she had retreated to a quiet corner to cry in private. They had waited in the shadows to ambush me. They were unable to execute their confrontation in the main hall, terrified that Marcus Caldwell or 100 other witnesses might intervene and witness their desperation. Richard closed the distance between us, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. He oscillated rapidly, vibrating with a toxic mixture of bruised fury and frantic fawning. "Is this some kind of sick game to you?" my father hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid echoing down the long corridor. "You humiliate your own flesh and blood in front of the entire Chicago business district. You let me stand there pitching a property to the man you work for, and you say nothing." He paced a tight circle in the narrow hallway, running a hand over his thinning hair. The indignation burned hot, but his greed quickly overpowered his anger. He stopped pacing and lunged back toward me. His tone shifted abruptly from accusation to a pleading, desperate negotiation. "You have his ear, Hazel. You write his speeches. I heard what he said out there. He values you. You are his top strategist." Richard reached out, his fingers twitching, as if he wanted to grab my shoulders, but he hesitated, perhaps realizing he no longer held the authority to touch me. "You can fix this. You can spin this narrative. Monday morning, you call his executive assistant. You arrange a formal sit-down, a lunch, just the three of us. You tell him your father is a vital, necessary partner for his harbor project." He was sinking, reaching for my hand to pull him onto a life raft, entirely forgetting he had spent the last 24 years trying to hold my head underwater. Before I could answer the absurd demand, Vanessa pushed her way forward. Her voice broke into a high, reedy sob. She played the only card she had left in her deck, playing the victim. "You planned this!" Vanessa cried, tears spilling over her lashes, ruining her careful, detached facade. "You orchestrated this entire spectacle just to destroy me. You knew Spencer left me. You knew my life was falling apart, and you could not stand it. You had to upstage me. You brought a billionaire to walk you down the aisle just to make me look like a fool in front of Gregory Vance and everyone else who matters. You are vindictive, Hazel. You are sick." She gasped for air, waiting for our old, established dynamic to engage. She waited for me to shrink, to apologize for shining too bright, to beg for her forgiveness, and to retreat back into my assigned role as the invisible, accommodating sister. I stood in the center of the corridor. The limestone walls felt cool and solid around me. I looked at my father, sweating in a tailored suit, begging for a business meeting he did not earn. I looked at my sister sobbing because the universe had briefly ceased revolving around her ego. Years ago, a confrontation like this would have triggered a severe panic attack. My chest would have tightened, my palms would have grown slick with sweat. I would have scrambled to assemble the broken pieces of their pride, sacrificing my own dignity to build them back up. Tonight, looking at their desperate faces, I felt a profound, sweeping apathy. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the sting of betrayal. I just felt tired of the performance. The emotional tether that bound me to their approval had dissolved into dust. They were strangers to me, speaking a language of manipulation I refused to translate anymore. I didn't hide anything, I said. My voice was calm, a flat, even surface reflecting their hysteria right back at them. You just never asked. Richard blinked, the frantic energy faltering for a moment. You never asked about my work, I continued, holding his gaze without wavering. You never asked about my clients or my long nights or the projects I was building. You asked what I did so you could categorize me. When you assumed I was a failure, you stopped paying attention. You built a narrative where I was a typist because it made you feel taller. I simply let you live in the fiction you created. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, a subtle, commanding gesture that stopped him cold. And no, Dad, I said, the syllables dropping like stones onto a glass floor, I will never introduce you to Marcus Caldwell. I will never set up a meeting, and I will never facilitate a lunch. His face contorted a mixture of rage and sheer disbelief. I am your father. You owe me this level of respect. It is family business. You are a terrible businessman, I countered the truth, piercing the stale air of the hallway. You pitch cheap properties to a man who demands excellence. You insult his staff by demanding special treatment, and you publicly abandon your daughter because you are too cowardly to support her. Marcus saw exactly who you are today. If I recommended you for a partnership, I would lose my own credibility. My credibility is worth infinitely more than your approval. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. Richard instinctively took a half step back, yielding the space. You belong exactly where you chose to sit today, I told him, ensuring every word landed with surgical precision. In the back, watching my life from a distance. I shifted my focus to my sister, who was staring at me with her mouth slightly open, the tears forgotten on her cheeks. Not everything is a reaction to you, Vanessa, I said gently, though the gentleness offered no comfort. My wedding was not a weapon forged to bruise your ego. My success has nothing to do with your failures. You are miserable because you measure your worth by the ring on your finger and the title on your door. I cannot fix that for you. I am no longer going to try. I reached up and adjusted the sheer edge of my veil, letting the delicate lace settle perfectly over my shoulders. I drew the final, unbreakable boundary in the limestone corridor, severing the toxic roots that had tangled around my ankles for over 2 decades. You are welcome to stay, I said, sweeping my gaze over both of them one last time. Go back into the hall, eat the dinner I paid for, have a drink, celebrate, or sit in the corner and pout. It makes no difference to me, but I am done shrinking to fit your insecurities. I am done minimizing my existence to protect your fragile egos. They stood in silence. The frantic fawning and the hysterical crying had burned out, leaving them with nothing but the cold, stark reality of my departure. They had no leverage left. They had no power to compel my obedience. I did not wait for an apology I knew they were incapable of offering. I turned my back on them. The heavy satin of my gown brushed against the stone walls as I walked away. I did not look over my shoulder. I listened to the sharp, steady click of my heels echoing down the hallway, drowning out the silence of the 2 people I left behind in the shadows. I walked back toward the music, the light, and the life I had earned. I stepped out of the shadowed limestone corridor and re-entered the vibrant expanse of the conservatory. The transition was immediate and visceral. Behind me lay the cold, stagnant air of my past, anchored by 2 people desperately clinging to a hierarchy that no longer existed. Ahead of me lay a room bathed in the warm indigo glow of the evening, pulsing with the rich, infectious rhythm of a 9-piece soul band. The brass section soared above the lively chatter, wrapping the space in an atmosphere of pure, unfiltered celebration. The suffocating corporate tension that had choked the early hours of the reception was entirely gone. The investors who had treated my wedding like a networking mixer had either departed or retreated to the corners, leaving the center of the room to those who actually came to celebrate. I scanned the edge of the polished wooden dance floor and found Lucas almost instantly. He was standing near a high-top table with his father, laughing at a shared joke, a glass of water resting in his hand. When he saw me emerge from the hallway, his smile softened into something deeply intimate and grounding. He excused himself, navigating through the crowd with an easy, unhurried grace. He did not interrogate me. He did not ask for a detailed report of the confrontation by the restrooms. He simply looked into my eyes, read the profound, sweeping relief settled across my features, and extended his hand. I placed my palm in his. He pulled me seamlessly into the rhythm of the music. We moved across the floor, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. Sarah and Emily danced a few feet away, laughing as they attempted a complicated spin that sent their dresses swirling. Martha and Tom swayed gently near the bandstand, radiating a quiet, enduring affection that spanned 4 decades of shared struggles and triumphs. This was my chosen family. They were the individuals who recognized my value when my title was nothing more than a freelance typist in a walk-up apartment. They did not require a billionaire to validate my existence. They saw the substance beneath the surface long before the rest of the room caught on. I rested my head against Lucas's chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart over the bass line of the band. The scent of his cedar cologne grounded me, anchoring my thoughts in the present moment. A profound realization washed over me, settling deep into my bones. For years, I believed my honor and my legitimacy were tied to my father. I thought I needed his arm to guide me down the aisle, assuming his presence was the ultimate stamp of approval required by society. I had internalized the cruel arithmetic of my family, believing my worth was a commodity they controlled. I was wrong. My honor was never dependent on Richard Montgomery. My honor was forged in the quiet, lonely hours of my hard work. It was built during the late nights spent drafting strategies at a scratched coffee shop table, staring at a glowing screen while my sister bragged about luxury cars. It was cultivated through the unwavering loyalty of my friends and the steadfast love of the man holding me. The respect I commanded today was not a gift handed down by a patriarch. It was an empire I constructed with my own 2 hands, block by block, in the shadows where they refused to look. The reception did not conclude with a manufactured theatrical exit. There were no dramatic sparklers lighting up the sky or orchestrated grand departures designed for a photography spread. It ended the way all genuine celebrations end, winding down organically into a state of contented exhaustion. The brass section played a final, lingering ballad that drifted up into the glass canopy. The waitstaff quietly cleared the remaining crystal glasses from the linen tablecloths, moving smoothly through the dwindling crowd. Before we departed, we found Marcus Caldwell standing near the coat check in the front vestibule. He was speaking quietly with the venue manager, looking entirely at ease in the waning hours of the evening. When we approached, he offered a warm, respectful nod. I hugged him a brief but deeply sincere embrace, thanking him again for showing up when it mattered most. He merely smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He told me to enjoy my weekend, to focus on my new husband, and to ignore every single incoming email until Monday morning. He walked out the front doors, a quiet giant returning to his own universe, leaving me perfectly secure in mine. I did not seek out my parents to say goodbye. I did not look for Vanessa to offer a parting pleasantry. Their presence in the room had faded into white noise. I noticed their empty chairs near the back of the hall, the napkins tossed carelessly onto the table, but the sight evoked zero emotion. They were no longer the main characters in my narrative. They were simply guests who had overstayed their welcome, trapped in a shallow world constructed of empty titles and fragile egos. Lucas and I walked out of the conservatory together, stepping into the crisp, refreshing autumn air. A sleek black car waited for us near the curb, its engine idling softly in the cool night. Lucas opened the door, offering his hand to help me manage the heavy satin of my gown. I slid into the leather seat, the physical exhaustion of the long day finally catching up to me, bringing with it a deep, satisfying peace. The driver shifted the vehicle into gear, pulling smoothly away from the botanical gardens and merging onto Lakeshore Drive. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. In the distance, the iconic Chicago skyline gleamed against the night sky, a towering landscape of steel and glass, illuminated by millions of tiny, brilliant lights, reflecting off the dark water of Lake Michigan. It was the city my father thought he owned, the corporate arena he believed dictated all value and human worth. I looked at those glowing towers and felt entirely unburdened. I was leaving the Montgomery family behind in the shadows of their own making. I was driving toward a future defined by authenticity, safety, and an unbreakable partnership. Your worth is not dictated by the people who refuse to see it. It is a harsh lesson to learn, especially when the people blinding themselves are your own flesh and blood. We are conditioned to endure, to shrink our ambitions, and to constantly seek the approval of those who wield their affection like a corporate transaction. We learn to accept the scraps of attention they drop from their high tables. But you do not have to play a rigged game. You do not have to accept a seat in the back row of your own life just to keep the peace for someone else. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not a shouting match in a crowded hallway. It is not a bitter argument or a frantic attempt to prove your detractors wrong. The finest revenge is simply letting toxic people witness the exact height of the pedestal you built for yourself. It is allowing them to watch you thrive from a distance they can no longer cross. It is walking away with your dignity intact, leaving them to realize that the person they underestimated, the one they cast aside, was the only one holding the keys to the kingdom. If you made it to the end of this journey, thank you for sitting with me. I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and share the exact moment you stopped waiting for toxic family approval. When did you finally draw the line and walk away from the people holding you down? I read every single one. Subscribe to Revenge Order for more stories about the quiet ones finding their voice, and I will see you in the next video. In the quiet twilight hours after the house has finally gone to sleep, many parents find themselves staring into the darkness, wrestling with a silent, heavy question. What are we actually building here? We live in a society that moves at a breakneck speed, deeply entwined with the modern American dream, a dream that so often confuses the price tag of a life with its actual breathing value. We push, we strive, and we measure our children against the relentless, unforgiving yardsticks of external success. But as the story of Hazel and the Montgomery family reveals, the foundation of a family cannot be poured from the concrete of status, nor can the walls be fortified by the flimsy drywall of public perception. Hazel's journey is not just a satisfying tale of tables turning on the arrogant, it is a profound, mirror-like reflection of the hidden fractures in modern parenting. It asks us to confront the uncomfortable truth about how we guide our children, the heavy responsibilities we bear, and the silent, echoing lessons we impart every time we choose our pride over their peace. To raise a child in today's highly visible culture is to navigate a minefield of glittering illusions. The Montgomerys, like so many families, fell into the trap of optics. Richard and Vanessa were blinded by the seductive lie of societal status. They mistook a person's net worth, their zip code, and their job title for their actual worth as a human being. This is a common affliction, a quiet epidemic, where parents push their children toward prestigious careers to reflect well on the family's image, rather than nurturing the child's authentic soul. But true wisdom, the kind we are tasked with passing down to the next generation, requires a deep, honest discernment. It requires us to sit our children down and teach them that true power is almost always invisible. Hazel did not build her empire of influence by shouting in boardrooms or demanding a seat at the head of the table. She built it through quiet, unwavering competence. As parents, our responsibility is to guide our children to detach their self-esteem from the unpredictable, fickle applause of the crowd. We must teach them that the optics of a situation, how things look to the neighbors, the colleagues, the extended family, are entirely meaningless compared to the integrity of the action itself. Fairness in a family means recognizing a child's intrinsic value, treating them with honesty, and honoring the quiet labor they contribute, even when it doesn't come with a shiny plaque or a public accolade. This brings us to the very bedrock of a traditional family structure morality. The deepest tragedy of the Montgomery household was not their arrogance, but the heartbreaking fact that their love was entirely transactional. Richard and Patricia's affection was a commodity doled out only when their children elevated the family brand and swiftly withdrawn when they did not. This kind of parenting creates deep spiritual and emotional wounds. It teaches children a devastating lie that they must perform to be worthy of love, that they are only as good as their latest achievement. The moral foundation of a family must be unconditional acceptance. A home should be a sanctuary from the cutthroat judgments of the world, not a brutal extension of it. When parents act out of ego, protecting their own fragile pride over their child's heart, just as Richard did by refusing to walk his daughter down the aisle, they fracture the family's spirit in ways that can take a lifetime to heal. Emotional awareness means practicing the morality of deep presence. It is looking at your child, truly looking at them and seeing them for exactly who they are, not for who they can be molded into. It is honoring their individual path, providing long-term guidance built on honesty rather than manipulation, even when that path diverges from the postcard-perfect image of success. Yet knowing these truths is only half the battle. Living them requires immense willpower. In corporate America and modern society, willpower is so often depicted as loud, aggressive dominance, the ability to crush the competition or force a room into submission. Hazel demonstrated a different, infinitely more powerful kind of willpower. Her strength was rooted in spiritual restraint. When attacked at her own rehearsal dinner, she did not yell. She did not seek petty revenge. She did not defend her bruised ego. She simply continued to do the work, trusting that the truth would eventually reveal itself. We must teach our children that true strength is quiet. It is the ability to endure misunderstanding without losing your inner peace. The world will inevitably underestimate those who do not boast. The world will overlook the quiet ones, the caregivers, the steady workers. But true willpower is maintaining your course when no one is watching, and setting firm, peaceful boundaries when the time comes. Hazel's ultimate act of willpower was drawing an unbreakable line with her toxic family. She taught us that a true spiritual practice does not mean absorbing abuse just to keep the peace. Sometimes it means possessing the fortitude to walk away from toxicity with a calm heart and a clear, unclouded mind. Stories like Hazel's remind us that we are the architects of our own lives, but we are also the authors of the narratives our children will carry into their futures. We are responsible for the voices in their heads. If you have ever felt the sting of transactional love, or if you are on a journey to break generational cycles and build a sanctuary of genuine worth for your own family, you are not alone in this fight. Subscribe and follow the channel Revenge Order for more stories that explore the deep, quiet strength it takes to reclaim your narrative and redefine what it means to truly win. The greatest legacy a parent can leave is not a trust fund, a prestigious network, or a recognized family name. It is a child who is so deeply anchored in their own self-worth that they never have to compromise their soul for a seat at the table. As the dust settles on the Montgomery family's shattered illusions, we are left to look into our own mirrors. The reflection asks us if we are building homes of sanctuary or stages for performance. It asks if we are loving our children for who they are or for the reflection they cast back upon us. The answers to these silent questions shape the generations to come. Perhaps the most profound truth is the one that remains unspoken, lingering in the quiet, shadowed spaces of our own homes long after the heavy oak doors have swung shut.